talking to Simon Fisher, who is the author of this book here, which is the biography of S.F. Edge, one of the leading pioneers of British motoring. So we're here to talk with Simon about his book and obviously S.F. Edge. And so Simon, would you like to introduce yourself? Perhaps you could tell us as a start, who you are, where you come from, and how you got to write this book.
Okay, thanks, Gareth. I'm Simon Fisher. I was born in Surrey quite some time ago. Qualified as a chartered accountant in London, and then almost immediately went out to Africa on a 6-month contract. As a bit of a joke out here that a lot of people come here on a short contract and they end up staying for life, which is what I've done. So from the age of 25, I've lived pretty well all the time in Eastern Africa. Always had an interest in early motoring and managed to keep that up despite being in Eastern Africa, which isn't the sort of centre of
there must be a limited amount of material that's certainly available close by, I guess.
No, indeed, yeah. But in a way, it sort of drove me to focus more on history of motoring rather than the actual sort of fettling of cars, which I would have done more of if I'd been in the UK.
And is early motoring your specific interest, or are you just interested in the history of the motor car all round?
Well, history generally, but Edwardian and vintage. I've owned a couple of Napiers at different times.
Right.
Both of them were 1913 Napiers. And I at the moment I have something called an HE, Herbert Engineering, 1929.
Yes, I've heard of a HE, yeah.
Right.
Okay. So maybe that leads us into S.F. Edge. Obviously, you mentioned Napier, and the two names are fairly closely linked. What brought you to write a book about S.F. Edge in particular?
Well, partly because it's not been done. He was a significant character in personality in early motoring, and there wasn't a proper biography of him. He wrote this book, My Motoring Reminiscences, in 1934, which some people refer to as an autobiography, but I don't regard it as that at all. It's strictly what it says on the tin. It's My Motoring Reminiscences.
It's sort of anecdotes rather than his career.
Yes, and it doesn't talk about his personal life at all. In fact, he never wrote about his family life. And the book, My Motoring Reminiscences, just has a photograph he wanted to include that happened to have his first wife in it.
Right.
And the caption was just, my first wife, brackets, deceased.
Right.
And that was his. I thought it was really odd, and that sort of
sure.
made me interested in finding out more about him.
Yeah.
And it started from there.
Yeah, I mean, picking up that sort of idea, I a couple of years ago reviewed a book, and we did a similar Brooklands TV interview with a guy called Oliver Heel, who wrote a book about Louis Coatlan. And I think, and I'm just reading a book about Louis Chiron, an Italian book actually. And I'm grateful, and I'm sure others are, that somebody has gone out and recorded the history of some of these people, because certainly, if you read the S.F. Edge book, your book on S.F. Edge, clearly SF was a very important person in the early days of British motoring, and it deserves that story is told. And I say Louis Coatlan, very much the same. He was, very important in Sunbeam, and Sunbeam were Britain's premier racing team in the early years. So slight overlap there, but I think it's important that these books get written, and so I personally would say, well, thanks for doing that, because I think that's important. To what extent, when you wrote that, and I think you sort of touched on it there, did you feel that you were writing the definitive history? Nobody's done it, I must get this right. Was there ever a sense of that when you wrote the book, or was it just purely, I want to put this on the record, or what?
Yeah, a bit of both. I was really interested in his family life, which is what was nothing about. When I started, I knew nothing about it.
Sure.
And I had to dig quite hard over a number of years. And yeah, I just thought he needs to be remembered. As I say in the book, he was a significant character. I wanted to put the record there.
Sure. In the book. So following on from that, obviously, we say he's important. I've read your book. You've obviously written it and done a lot of research. What do you think were the key achievements of S.F. Edge? What do you think were, where has he made a difference in motoring history?
Right. Well, I mean, in two ways, because he sort of helped establish the industry. He persuaded Montague Napier to start making cars, and it's quite possible that Napier wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for Edge. And Napier, in the early years of the last century, Napier was the leading British manufacturer and the leading motor racing car at that time. So, yeah, he helped establish the industry, and then he helped establish motor racing as a British sport.
Right.
His first real achievement, was winning the 1902 Gordon Bennett Trophy, which was the first time a British car had won an international motor race with a British driver. Then he went on to set his 24-hour record at Brooklands just before it officially opened, or its first race meeting. And the first couple of years of Brooklands, Sammy Davis said, as I quoted in the book, that he really sort of helped Brooklands to succeed. It might have been a big flop if it hadn't been for Edge and Napier.
Yeah, he brought a lot of publicity to Brooklands.
Yes, he actually had a racing team. I mean, he was perhaps sort of the first manager of a racing team.
Right.
With a small fleet of Napiers, and very active at Brooklands until late in 1908.
Okay. I mean, going back there to the Gordon Bennett race in 1902, I recently reviewed a book about the 1903 race, which of course was held in Ireland because Edge had won the 1902 race. One of the things I found amusing or interesting when I read the SF book, your book, was actually the early Gordon Bennett races, which wasn't the case in 1903, but in the early races, they were actually part of another race, but only part of it. And the main race was much more open, whereas for the Gordon Bennett races, one of the key things was the car was wholly built in the country of the entrant. So obviously the Napier, and the year before, in 1901, I think I'm right in saying, Edge, I think, got disqualified from the Gordon Bennett, although not the other race, because he had to put some French tyres on. But when it came to 1902, he didn't. And could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about that 1902 race and SF's adventure on that, and how he won the race? And obviously, consequently, it was held in 1903 in Ireland.
Yes, as you say, it was actually, there was a Paris-Vienna race, and the Gordon Bennett was run concurrently with that and finished in Innsbruck. But Edge did then drive on to Vienna and was placed sort of midfield in the overall race. The Gordon Bennett, the rules were that it was each country entered a team, and so in fact it wasn't the winner of the Gordon Bennett wasn't Edge or Napier, it was the Automobile Club of Great Britain that in theory had entered the team.
Sure, he was privileged to drive for them, was he?
Yes. And as I think you're saying, as a result, the rules were that the winning country would hold the race in the following year. Road racing wasn't allowed in the UK in 1903, but they managed to get an Act of Parliament passed so that it could be held in Ireland. And as you say, there used to be city-to-city races like Paris-Vienna. But there was the Paris-Madrid race that had been such a disaster just before the 1903 Gordon Bennett.
I remember that from reading the book about the 1903 race, because, as you rightly say, I think the notorious Paris-Madrid race that was ended at Bordeaux because there had been so many people killed and it was so badly managed and everything. One of the things when the Gordon Bennett race in 1903 was held in Ireland, was it was on a closed circuit, which was deemed and probably proved to be so much safer because they could control the crowd a lot more. So that was quite an interesting feature of that race. But they were those city-to-city races, which were the early events, were somewhat precarious to say the least, particularly with cars that had very limited brakes. So if you were in the way of it, it wasn't going to get out. The vehicle was sort of immovable. It was coming towards you at great speed with no ways of stopping, really.
Yes, I mean, quite a lot of spectators were killed in those early days.
Yeah.
As well as many drivers and mechanics.
And in that 1902 race, Edge was the only finisher in the Gordon Bennett part of it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the sort of irony. He won through perseverance and endurance. And yeah, there were 3 French cars that didn't make it to the end, and one other British car that didn't get very far either. So he was the only one to finish.
Sure.
But that made him the winner, and it was a deserved win because it was a very tough endurance race.
Obviously, yes. Just to get to the end was an achievement in itself.
Yeah.
We've talked about a little bit about his sort of mid-career, if you like, in terms of motor racing. One of the things that obviously comes across in the book was actually before the motor car, there was the bicycle, and he was very involved in bicycle racing and that industry as well, and developing that industry. Can you tell us something about that? How important was he in that world, and what was his achievements and stuff?
Yes, again, he was a very significant player in cycling. Prominent member of the Annalay Bicycle Club, which was one of the main bicycle clubs at the time. And this was just before the car was allowed on the roads of England. So cycling was the thing, and particularly racing. And yeah, I mean the racing itself was amazing. The roads weren't very good, but he would regularly do 100 miles in 6 hours.
Yeah. He must have been quite some athlete, I should think, in his day.
Yes, although apparently he had weak lungs when he was a child, wasn't allowed to play sport at school.
Right.
It was his own decision against his doctor's advice to train himself and get fit.
Okay.
So he went on to be a very successful cyclist.
And he was involved in that industry. I think he was a salesman, wasn't he, or even more than that?
Yes, he started as a salesman. I think mainly for Marriott and Cooper. Then he got sort of spotted by Harvey de Croo, who made him the manager of his London branch.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, he was quite an important figure in the early years of the Dunlop pneumatic tyre company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, developed that as a pneumatic tyre manufacturer.
Yeah, and then I think, was it 1895, he went to France, to Paris, to meet a friend of his from the cycling fraternity, and that was his first ride in a motor car.
That's right, yes. He went, it was Fernand Charon
Mm-hmm.
that he'd met on cycling races. Charon didn't speak English, Edge didn't speak French, but they had a common bond of cycle racing.
Of course, yeah.
And yeah, Charon took him for a drive around Paris, and that changed his life. Sort of.
I mean, there's a quote in the book. He said something about the horse was sort of dead as a means of transport. I forget. Can you remember the exact words he said?
Yeah, I remember something pretty close to that. This is the end of the horse as a means of transport.
A means of transport, yeah. Which was quite visionary of him, I guess, at the time. I mean,
yes,
the motor car was very, very much in its early years. I mean, that's only 10 years after Ben's three-wheeler, so, and there was very little in terms of motor industry, virtually nothing in the UK at that time, I know.
Yeah, and of course, initially it was a rich man's toy. It wasn't seen as a practical form of transport.
And he bought his own car about 3 years later, was it 1898, if I remember rightly?
Yes, he bought a Panhard first from Harry Lawson, and then he bought De Dion motor tricycle.
Right.
Yeah, and a number of motor tricycles actually. He had a.
Was it the Panhard? You said a Panhard, didn't you? Was his first car?
Yes.
Was that the car that he sent to Napier's to have improved? That's how the relationship started, is it not?
Yes, it was. Yeah, he first of all gave it to Napier and said, "Can you fit a steering wheel rather than tiller steering?"
Right.
And pneumatic tires, and then it was switched from this hot tube ignition to coil and spark ignition.
And he very much encouraged, even more than encouraged, Napier's to actually move into vehicle motor manufacture. Am I correct? He sort of persuaded, because they were just an engineering company, weren't they not?
Yeah, they'd been doing weighing machines and printing presses and
right,
that sort of thing until Montagu Napier took it over.
Right.
Yes, Edge then said, "Can you build a new engine altogether for this Panhard?" Which he did, and then persuaded him to build a complete car.
Sure. I mean,
the first of which was in the 1,000-mile trial.
Right, which was in which year?
1900, yeah.
And the 1,000-mile trial, where did that go?
Well, all around the UK.
Right.
London up into Scotland and back again. It was
right.
It was several days, I think a couple of weeks.
And Edge participated in that?
Yes, he drove this Napier that had only just been built. It had already been sold to a customer, but he persuaded the customer to
right. So the customers got a slightly used motor car then?
Yes, well, it was on condition that the customer could ride with in the trial.
Oh, I see. Right, so the customer knew it hadn't been trashed.
Yeah, and it did pretty well. It wasn't deemed to be the overall winner, which was Charles Rolls in a Panhard, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, he was very much. He's one of the characters that comes out in the book, as well as one of the sort of leading British motorists of the time, Charles Rolls.
Yes, well, in many ways, he as it says in the book, he copied Edge's sort of business model.
Yeah,
he set up his own car sales agency, and then found a British manufacturer to team up with.
Sure.
And was like the exclusive agent for Royce's cars.
Yeah. Okay.
But then met an early death, unfortunately.
Yes, indeed. Okay, that sort of brings us into really SF's business dealings, because not only was he an early pioneer in terms of racing, and I mean, even if you take a step back to his cycling days, what you mention in the book is that he was, when he was cycling, he was almost indulged by his employers his racing career, simply because, you know, the idea of win on Sunday, sell on Monday went as far back as cycling. I mean, which is often used in the motor racing world to justify motor racing, but it happened even before that in cycling. But to move us back to, say, the early 1900s, the Edwardian era, Edge was very much involved from the commercial side of the motor industry and made a lot of money. Maybe you could tell us something about his business activities.
Yes, incredibly complex, his business affairs. I spent a lot of time trying to work out what was going on, and you just couldn't track everything. He had a finger in a lot of pies. But obviously his SF Edge Limited, which was the sales agency, the exclusive sales agency for Napier, was the main business, and probably made most of his money that way. But some of the complexity was this relationship with Ducrot, that he was involved in other companies with Ducrot, which eventually sort of Ducrot took over, and then later on Edge. And
there were various conflicts of interest and quite a few court cases as well, I think, weren't
there? Yeah, yes, he had to sue Ducrot because he reckoned he was entitled to some of the profits of the Panhard agency.
Right.
And there were other agencies going on at the same time. He had some involvement in Ariel, as well as there was Clement Panhard and Gladiator, a short agency for Regent car, and various other things.
Sure. I mean, it was an industry, I'm sure, that was evolving very quickly. I think I'm right in saying the first cars built in Britain were as late as, is it 1897? I think the first British built cars were 1896, 1897. So you're only really just talking about the first few years of the British motor industry, really.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so there would be these entrepreneurs bouncing about. And then, of course, we touched on he had various legal cases, but he fell out with everybody and sold up, didn't he? Really? Well, I say he fell out with everybody. Perhaps you could explain that a bit more. But he moved completely out of the industry and into farming.
Yes. Well, he fell out with Napier. I think there were problems on both sides. Edge felt that actually Napier wasn't keeping up, particularly with Rolls-Royce. You could see that Rolls-Royce were doing better than Napier. They had become a bit stuck in their ways. They weren't very innovative around sort of 1910 onwards. So he was getting a bit fed up with Napier. Napier was fed up because Edge was making more money out of it than Napier, more money per car.
Sure.
than the Napier factory was. So yeah, they decided to part company. Edge sold his company, SF Edge Limited, to Napier, and eventually, fairly quickly, those were merged together. And a condition of that, because Napier paid him about £160,000, which is quite a lot of money in those days.
Yeah, certainly.
But on condition that Edge didn't compete with Napier.
Sure.
So he had to stay out of the motor industry altogether for 7 years.
Right.
And he already owned a lot of farms, land and farms in Sussex. So devoted himself to pig farming.
Right. It's interesting you should mention, obviously, how Napier was losing the edge there. I came across recently a story sort of that we've mentioned Rolls-Royce, and of course, to a large extent, Rolls-Royce's reputation as the best car in the world came from the 1907 London-Edinburgh run, and they kept going and did 14,500 miles doing nothing more than change tires, I think, and a little bit of basic maintenance work, which sort of proved the quality of the Rolls motor car. And I think Napier at the time were sort of claiming they were the best car in the world, and I think there was some sort of endurance event they'd been involved in. Is that right, or are you not aware of that story?
Yes, they did a London-Edinburgh drive as well, but I think the reality of it weren't quite as successful as Rolls-Royce.
Of course, Napier, I'm not quite sure, when did they get out of car making? It was fairly not that long after that, was it?
Well, 1924, after the
Right.
Well, during the First World War, they moved into aero engines, the same as Rolls-Royce.
Right.
After the First World War, they continued making. They had a very successful aero engine, the Lion, but they tried making a luxury car, again competing with Rolls-Royce. Only sold about 200 of them up until 1924, and just gave up. They had a lot of labour problems and strikes.
Okay, and ironically, they nearly bought Bentley in 1931.
Yes, in 1930, they tried to get hold of the Bentley company, which was in receivership, and were outbid by Rolls-Royce in a slightly sneaky way, as is well documented elsewhere.
Sure.
So they just gave up the idea of cars and stuck with their aero engines. Of course, went on Second World War, very significant aero engine builder again.
Of course. Let's go back to the farming years. SF and mentioned the First World War, when he actually got involved in the Ministry of Agriculture, was it? And he sort of had a bit of a run-in with one certain Winston Churchill.
Yes, not Sir at that time. Yeah, it was the Ministry of Munitions, which had a very wide-ranging brief, actually, because it had a food control department and an agricultural machinery department, which is what Edge was put in charge of.
Right.
Because tractors, surprisingly enough, and tractors were in quite an early stage of their development. You'd had these steam traction engines that were doing most of the farm work. So it was at the time that tractors were taking over from steam engines, and he was trying to promote the production of tractors, and hence food production as a result. But he wasn't suited to working for the government. He'd been his own boss for a long time, and was fairly opinionated.
Sure.
And he fell out with the Sir Arthur Lee, who was in the food control department. And that led to Winston Churchill asking him to resign, which he refused to do. But so Winston Churchill had to appoint someone in his place.
Right. Actually, Edge was proved right, I think, was he not? Rather than they were effectively, he went against the grain, and but he was probably right in what he was saying. Is that not correct?
Yes, I mean it's difficult to tell, but I think that's probably the case. That the trouble was he just was too outspoken. If he thought something was wrong, he said it was wrong, and not everyone in government likes that.
Not that Winston Churchill ever did that, of course.
Right.
Yeah. So let's move on to his post World War I career, and obviously he got involved in AC Cars and Cubit as well. Perhaps you could tell us something about those two mix of cars and what Edge's involvement was.
Yeah, well, clearly he was very keen to get back into the motor industry as soon as he was allowed to by this non-compete agreement. Almost by coincidence, I think he'd driven an AC during the war. His more economical car for time use was a small AC with a 4-cylinder engine, so he knew the company. And then Weller, who was the engineer in AC, designed a 6-cylinder engine, a very good 6-cylinder engine, which would have appealed to Edge as well. So he started buying up shares as soon as he could. When he had enough shares, and it's not clear what sort of percentage, I mean, he wasn't owning 50% or more of the shares at that time, but he had enough shares to be invited onto the board of AC. And he quite quickly became the governing director of AC. And in fact, the two previous owners, Weller and Portwine, resigned from the board, probably still held some shares.
Right.
And so by that stage, he'd taken it over completely. He then bought into Cubit, which was trying to be a mass production manufacturer, not in Aylesbury, not very successful. He thought combining it with AC could increase production capacity generally, but it was difficult times for the motor industry and for the economy generally. And Cubit went under first, went into liquidation, and then eventually AC. It went in and out of receivership a couple of times during the 20s. It eventually went into liquidation, and that was the end for SF.
Yeah. And at that stage, I mean, he pretty much retired. Am I right in thinking? Or
yes, he really.
Although he'd lost quite a lot of his money, he still could afford to sort of retire, and he had a fairly young family, I think, didn't he? Still at that stage.
That's right. Yes.
Maybe we can talk about his personal life a little bit more now. Obviously, he was married first to a lady he met through cycling, and I think lived down the road from him, didn't she?
Yes.
And then later on, that marriage didn't work out eventually. And then I think after the First World War, he got married a second time. Is that right, or was involved with the lady?
It was during the Second World War. It was 1917. It was just at the time he was appointed to the Ministry of Munitions. And
right.
Yes, I mean, cynically, one could say he married her so that she could look after the farm while he went off to work in the city.
Right.
But I'm not sure how long they'd had a relationship before that.
Sure.
But she started as his secretary, became his sort of business manager, farm manager. There's a lovely bit of video on Cathay News's website showing her running around in a pigsty. So she was really mucking in on the farm.
And she was,
and
her
she
name
did
was?
run it while he was in Ministry of Munitions. Yeah.
Yeah, and she was, her name and her background?
She was Myra Martin.
Right.
Not very much known about her background. I think she was orphaned fairly early on and lived with an aunt and uncle. Trained as a stenographer.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, and we don't know the date, she became secretary to SF. We assume it was after he split with Napier. So
yeah. And his relationship with his first wife was well over by then, wasn't it? I think that broke up sometime before that.
Yeah, again, date not certain, but they were separated sometime between 1907 and 1910.
Yeah.
And then Eleanor, his first wife, died in 1914.
Right. But he met her through. Did he meet her through cycling, or I can't remember? She lived down the road, I think, didn't she, or something as well? Yes,
I mean she was a neighbour. I think 4 years younger than him, and she was quite keen on cycling.
Right.
So they went on many long trips. They would cycle to Chelsea, which is quite a ride.
Yeah.
From Norwood to Chelsea.
She must have been quite some lady herself, I should think. Quite, again, athletic and quite sturdy.
Yeah.
I mean, and probably somewhat of a pioneer for women in those days. Cycling, sports cycling, I would have thought was not something young ladies did.
No, yeah, she did lead the way on that, and she featured in cycling magazines 2 or 3 times as being a sort of pioneer ladies cycling.
Okay. So let's move towards the later part of Napier's life. Sorry, Edge's life. As we say, he got involved in AC and Cubit, and eventually those unfortunately didn't turn out particularly well. How did he spend his later years, and when did he die?
Right. Well, he really withdrew from public life. He'd lost a lot of money with Cubit and AC, and it looks like he had to sell all his farms, but ended up with a house where he brought up his 2 young daughters. He was a bit involved with the Veteran Car Club. He wasn't a founder of the Veteran Car Club, but he acted as judge on a number of events of the Veteran Car Club in the 30s.
I guess as a elder statesman of the industry and celebrity, if you like, in that capacity.
Yeah, yes, certainly well regarded by the Veteran Car Club. And then there was at Brooklands, there was in 1937 the opening of the Campbell circuit.
Right.
Where someone lent him a 1903 Napier, right, which he drove on the track in 1937.
He opened the Campbell circuit.
Yeah, well, it was Dame Ethel Locke King that actually opened the track, but then he drove on it in a 1903 Napier.
Right. Okay.
And that was pretty well his last public appearance.
Sure. He died.
He was in poor health at that time. In the photographs of Brooklands in 1937, he looks very frail.
Yeah.
And he was about 69 then, but he looks his age.
And he died only a couple of years later, I think.
1940, early 1940, yeah.
Right. Okay. And his gravestone is in Tilford, down in Surrey, sort of.
Yes, near Frensham.
Yeah, I've been once. We ran a Brooklands event to a museum just down the road, and somebody said, "Oh, S.F. Edge is it's not a tombstone. It's a block of rock, isn't it? I struggled to find it, but it's in the church at Tilford, which is a rather nice, just off the village green there, the old church and the village green with the pub, and it's a cricket pitch. It sort of really is picture postcard England village green. But that's where his stone is, and I'm presuming that's where he was buried.
Yes, well, he was cremated, so it's just his ashes.
Ah, right, okay.
And his, very much later, his second wife was buried there as well. Probably just ashes as well. And before that, his cousin Cecil Edge, who died at quite a young age, was buried there as well. So it's all three of them on the stone.
Okay. And he lived out his last few years in Surrey there, or was he still down in Sussex?
No, it would be Surrey. It was a house called Dentdale.
Right.
In that sort of area.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. We've talked quite a lot about Edge and the like. I'd like to just explore a little bit about how you found writing the book. Did you have frustrations in doing that, or did you find it an easy process? How easy was it to research and write the book, particularly as you're located in Africa? Not you can't walk up to Brooklands and go through the archives or the RAC club.
Yeah, well, I did spend several days at the Veteran Car Club headquarters in Ashwell.
Right.
So it was almost like every time I was back in England, I had to spend one day in the library at the Veteran Car Club, because they have the press cuttings that Edge kept for most of his adult life. Huge books of press cuttings, quite overwhelming, in fact. I mean, the first time I went there, I was just overwhelmed. I just sort of turned the pages and
you thought you were turning up for half a day and thought, well, I should have been here booked a week, I suppose.
Yes, it was like that. So, and it was probably another year before I went back and said, this time I must sit down with my laptop. And
so how many years did it take you to write the book?
About 6.
Right.
And I have to admit, I almost gave up at one stage. I'd written a sort of 2 or 3 chapters and got like writer's block. And one has to thank COVID-19 for inspiring me to get stuck in again.
I think it made a lot of people do things they wouldn't normally do. I personally wrote an article, a double article for the Brooklands Bulletin on Sir Henry Seagrave, and that was very much. I knew a local antique stroke gift shop to where I was working had a collection of second-hand motoring books, and I thought, I wonder if there's anything here I can read about that's relevant to Brooklands, and read the Seagrave book, and that was my project when I was in lockdown, was to write quite a large article on him, and somebody who, a little bit like Edge, it was something. My knowledge of Edge before I read the book was, it's a name that crops up, and it obviously was important. What was important about him, and obviously the books fill me in on that. Seagrave was very much the same. It was a name that I knew. So yeah, obviously, as you say, COVID. Obviously, we don't wish COVID would ever happen, but it did. I think, change a lot for a lot of people.
Yes.
Yeah. And have you any plans to do any more books at all, or anything?
I'm thinking about it. The trouble is that Edge did stand out as a sort of obvious choice. There was Charles Jarrett mentioned quite a lot in the book.
Yes.
Who does? I mean, he wrote his own book in 1906. He deserves a full biography as well.
I mean, one of the nice things in the book, I thought, in the book, is towards the end you have a chapter about the characters that were around at the time and the other key characters. We can just see some here, I think. So I thought that was an interesting part of the book to, talk about the personalities that were contemporaries of Edge's and also had their input into the development of the early British motor industry. One of the things about the book I noticed as well is that you actually got sponsorship from the Michael Sedgwick Trust. I think that's right, it's called, isn't it? Can you just tell us a little bit about them and what they do? I've come across them.
Yes, they were set up some time ago in memory of Michael Sedgwick. Who was,
I think, in the early 80s, wasn't it? In the 1980s.
Yeah, probably, yes. He would have died around then. Yeah, I remember going to an early Bewley Auto Jumble where Michael Sedgwick was the commentator, had a very distinctive voice. Would talk about Austins rather than Austins and things like that.
Right.
So it was set up in his memory because he died at a fairly early age, I think. And it's to promote motoring history, books about motoring history. And it has a group of trustees. So when I'd got a fairly advanced stage with the draft, I put in an application, asked if they could help with them. Had to pay quite a bit for some of the images where one actually pays for licenses to publish images from held by.
And that's where they help contribute to the book, basically.
So they contributed to that, and then the book really had to have an index, and that costs a bit of money as well. So they sponsored the index.
The actual index that the book takes a lot of effort, presumably, then, does it?
It would have been very hard work. I thought I could perhaps have a go at doing it myself. When I saw what was produced professionally through EVRO, I think
I guess they have computer models these days that do that quite much better.
It must be, but yes, I couldn't have written an index like that. It's very detailed.
Sure. Okay. So we sit back and wait for the Jarrett book then.
Okay. Yes, it was either him or Harvey Ducrot, who also deserves a biography.
Right. Well, so, I do hope you move on to writing those books.
Okay, thank you.
I think, in summary, I found the SF Edge book very interesting. Very pleased that you've, as I say, taken the time and effort. There's nobody goes into writing these books for money. It's through your own personal enthusiasm, and we've got now a record of a very key character in British motoring. I'd like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk to you, and thank you very much again.
Okay, thank you for having me.
That's our pleasure. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.